रबिश राहली सदरी वयसिरली अमरी वालुल उक़दतम मिन लिसानी यफ़क़हू क़ौली औज़ु बिल्लाहि मिनश शैतानिर रजीम बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहमानिर रहीम अस्सलामु अलैकुम. Let's start the brief explanation of the 22nd para with the dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to open our hearts to the message of the Quran. Ameen. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Al-Ahzab, which was revealed in the 5th Hijri in Medina. The central subject of this surah is to leave hypocrisy and to follow all the social, cultural, political and other collective commands of Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 4, Allah does not place two hearts in any person's chest, nor does he regard your wives as unlawful for you like your real mothers, even if you say they are, nor does he regard your adopted children as your real children. These are only your baseless assertions, but Allah declares the truth, and He alone guides to the right way. Here we are told that one person cannot be a believer and a hypocrite at the same time. Every person has one heart, right? So it can either be filled with Iman or Kufr. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions two relationships which the Arabs had false concepts about. First was zihar, which was a term in Arabic. In old days, when an Arab quarreled with his wife, he would compare her to his mother. For them, it meant that his wife was not lawful for him anymore. And the second was that they considered adopted sons as real sons and gave them the same rights and privileges. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that both concepts are wrong. Reality doesn't change because you say so. Similarly, calling someone your brother or sister doesn't make them your real brother or sisters. Your real relations are the ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose for you. In verse 5, the command comes to call the adopted child with his real father's name. Why? Because Islam protects the lineage of every person. As soon as this verse was revealed, the name of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's adopted son Zaid bin Muhammad was changed to his real father's name, Zaid bin Haris. You see how quickly the Muslims obeyed the commands revealed in the Quran. Can we say the same thing about ourselves? Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 6, the Prophet is closer to the believers than their own selves, and his wives are their mothers. The relationship of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam with the Muslims is superior to all other relations. Whatever Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did for us can only lead to our eternal happiness. Even our best well-wishers cannot claim this, right? So Muslims should also regard him dearer than his own parents, their own children, their own selves. They should love him more than anything and anybody else in the world, and they should prefer his judgment and opinion to their own. We are also told in this verse that the wives of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam are our mothers. They are called Ummahatul Mu'mineen, mothers of the believers. For a girl, her first role model is her mother. We are so unfortunate that most of us don't even know the names of these mothers of ours, let alone their life histories. Believe me, if we got to know about them, we would fall in love with their personalities and would want to be like them. Verses 9 to 27 is a commentary on the Battle of Ahzab and the raid against the Bani Qurayza. Battle of Ahzab is also known as the Battle of the Ditch and the Battle of Khandak. Why this battle took place? Because the Quraysh had mobilized different tribes, including some Jewish tribes, so they could take a great army to attack Medina. They intended to fight Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and wipe out every trace of Islam. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam consulted with the Muslims so they could agree on a plan of action. Hazrat Salman Farsi gave a suggestion to protect the city by digging a trench around it. This strategy was used in Persia but was unknown in Arabia. The companions and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself tirelessly dug a trench for around 10 days, which would be able to protect Medina. When the enemies arrived, they were shocked that they could not enter the city. They had come with such confidence of their victory, as they had come with a huge army of around 10,000 people. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam faced this mighty force with around 3,000 people. The women and children were left in Medina, as there was a Jewish tribe called Banu Qurayza in the southeast of Medina, which had a treaty with the Muslims. Despite the agreement on helping each other, the Jews broke the treaty at a crucial moment and increased the tension in the Muslim camp. But we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always helps the firm believers. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 9, O believers, remember Allah's favor upon you when enemy forces come to besiege you in Medina. So we sent against them a bitter wind and forces you could not see, and Allah is all seeing of what you do. As the enemy forces camped outside the trench, a severe storm with strong winds and heavy rain struck their camp. The storm was so intense that it caused their tents to collapse, extinguish their fires, and disrupt their morale. At one time, time the situation was so tense that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 10, remember when they came at you from east and west, when your eyes grew wild with horror and your hearts jumped into your throat and you entertained conflicting thoughts about Allah. This was the time when the hypocrites started making excuses and asked permission to go back to Medina. And what was the condition of the true believers? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 22, when the believers saw the enemy alliance, they said, this is what Allah and His Messenger had promised us. The promise of Allah and His Messenger has come true, and this only increased them in faith and submission. Same situation, but two totally different reactions. This is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests us, because when trials come, only then it becomes clear who is loyal to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger and who is a Muslim in name only. This battle proved to be a huge victory for the Muslims and teaches us that no matter how strong your enemy is, they will not be able to defeat you if you have the support of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. From verses 28, some social and family laws are given. The first commands are addressed to the wives of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It is being explained to them that due to their noble status, their responsibility and conduct had to be of the highest standard. They were not like ordinary women, but were to be the role models for all Muslim women. Verses 32 and 33 give some further instructions to the wives of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Before we get to that, let me ask you a question. Are these instructions just for them? No, they are for all Muslim women. Why? Because as our mothers, the wives of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam are our role models, right? So what are these instructions? If you fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, do not be soft in speech when talking to a non-mahram. Remember we talked about non-mahrams in Surah Noor as well. So non-mahrams here include your cousins, male colleagues and friends as well. Does this mean that we should be rude or harsh to them? No, just talk normally, but without giggling, joking or speaking in a seductive tone. Be serious and talk to the point. Why are these instructions being given? So the other person does not get the wrong idea. This is for our own protection. The next command is to stay at home. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling women that their primary job and first priority is their home and their families. In a normal situation, if after doing her main job, she has time and energy to work for some reason, she may do so. But she should know that Islam has set some regulations to protect working women. This includes the dress code. If you have to go out, then you should wear hijab and cover yourself with loose clothing. You want to dress up? Then do so in front of your mahram relations and other women. Why do you want to show your beauty to strangers? Further instructions include the order to establish prayer, pay zakat, and obey Allah and His Messenger. In short, be like the mothers of the believers who led such productive life while following the teachings of Islam. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 35, surely for Muslim men and women, believing men and women, obedient men and women, truthful men and women, patient men and women, humble men and women, charitable men and women, fasting men and women who guard their chastity, and men and women who remember Allah often. For all of them, Allah has prepared forgiveness and a great reward. These are the basic values of Islam which have to be followed by both men and women, and the reward for the followers, irrespective of their gender, will be the same. Verse 53 contains special commandments about the family life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Muslims were told not to enter the house of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam without permission. If invited to his house, come on time and do not linger. If there is a need to ask his wives for something, ask them from behind a barrier. In verse 55, the believers are commanded to send durood on Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Verse 59 is a general command to the Prophet's wives, daughters and all Muslim women. O Prophet, ask your wives, daughters and believing women to draw their cloaks over their bodies. In this way, it is more likely that they will be recognized as virtuous and not be harassed. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all forgiving, most merciful. All women are instructed here that when they leave their homes, they should cover their bodies and heads with an outer garment. Why? So they would be recognized as decent and virtuous women. You see, all commands from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are for our own benefit. They help us in this world and they will be a means to get to Jannah in the hereafter. Surah Saba. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Saba, which was revealed in the second phase of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's stay in Makkah. The central theme of this surah is belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, life after death, and prophethood of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The surah starts with the praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Next, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks of his grateful servants and how he favored them. First, Dawud alayhi salam and the miracles given to him are mentioned in verse 10. Indeed, we granted Daud a great privilege from us, commanding, O mountains, echo his hymns, and the birds as well. And we made iron moldable for him. His son, and also a prophet of Allah, Hazrat Sulaiman alayhi salam, was also given many blessings. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and we subjected the wind for Suleiman, its outward journey to command, and its return journey likewise. We made a fountain of molten brass flow for him, and some of the jinn worked under his control with Allah's permission. Both these prophets were given great miracles. They had authority over large kingdoms, and yet they were humble. They ruled their people with justice and were always grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the story of the people of Saba, who because of their ingratitude met a miserable end. Verses 22 and 23 take us to the day of judgment, where all the so-called gods will be powerless. No one will be able to intercede on behalf of anyone, and only those who would be given permission to speak will be able to do so. Surah Fatir. Let's take a look at the flowchart of microstructure of Surah Fatir, which was revealed in the third phase of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's stay in Makkah. The central subject of this surah deals with the understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's law of reward and punishment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 1, All praise be to Allah, the fashioner of the heavens and the earth, who appointed angels as his message bearers, having 2, 3, 4 wings. He adds to his creation whatever he pleases. Verily Allah has power over everything. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is introducing himself to us in this verse and letting us know about another creation of his, the angels, whose only job is to obey him. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 2, No one can withhold the blessing God opens up for his people, nor can anyone but him release whatever he withholds. He is the Almighty, the All-Wise. Here the lesson for us is to let go of all superstitions, because only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has all the power. What he wills happens, and what he does not will does not happen. No one can give what he withholds, and no one can withhold what he gives. So trust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and only ask from him. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns us of shaitan. We are told in verse 6, Surely, Shaitan is an enemy to you. Therefore, do take him as an enemy. He calls his followers to his way, so that they may be among the inmates of the fire. We all know this, but we are still deceived by him. He still tricks us into committing sins. So how do we protect ourselves? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us of a business that will never experience loss. He says in verse 29, Indeed, those who recite the book of Allah and establish prayer and spend in his cause out of what we have provided for them, secretly and publicly, can expect profit that will never perish. How can I start this most profitable trade? By doing 3 things only. Get connected to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, establish prayer, and do charity secretly and publicly. Why secretly? Because it prevents the dignity of those who receive that charity and also prevents us from boasting and showing off. Then why publicly? So others are also encouraged by us. This brings us to the end of today's lesson and to the question I'm going to ask myself today. The question is, how can I save myself from being tricked by shaitan? Inshallah, we will meet again tomorrow with the next para.